My name is Paul Hunt, University of Essex Human Rights Centre, University of Waikato, New Zealand, formerly the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. We're gradually working that out. It's a big question, and I think that the way we're approaching it is really like this. We're looking at parts of a health system and applying a human rights-based approach to parts of a health system. So, for instance, we do now have health professionals and human rights people have together worked out technical guidance on a human rights-based approach to deal with maternal mortality and morbidity. We do now have technical guidance that looks at a human rights-based approach to issues around family planning, and so forth and so on. So we're gradually applying this fairly new rights-based approach to different bits of a health system. And that way we'll learn from experience, and that way the packages are manageable. We do need to turn our mind to, of course, a human rights-based approach to health systems, but it's still very much work in progress. But it'll require us to think about things like issues of equitable access for all. It'll require us to think about a progressive realization that some countries have more resources than other countries, so we have to calibrate in that difference. It requires a bundle of services and facilities available to everybody, and it's not yet quite clear, at least in the human rights community, what that bundle is. It requires participation. From the human rights point of view, a system should be as participatory as possible. So ordinary individuals should have opportunities to contribute to the health system policies. So participation is an important element. I could go on, but one final point that I'll mention is accountability. So a health system, to conform to a human rights-based approach, does require effective, accessible, transparent mechanisms of accountability. I suspect that in some countries there'll have to be very significant structural changes, but perhaps not in all countries. And I think we'll have to very carefully apply a human rights-based approach to what is there, and then health professionals, human rights professionals, and many others sitting down and thinking about, well, how has this got to change to conform to binding national and international human rights law? So for some systems, I'm sure there'll have to be deep changes, perhaps not for all. I should say that some work has been done of a fairly sort of high-level conceptual nature on the application of a human rights-based approach to health systems. But I think now we need to get to a different level, a much more operational level, and it'll help, I think, if we've got this experience in these more discrete, manageable areas before we try and turn the human rights lens to health systems as a whole. Well, first, I think there are a number of interesting intersecting things happening around now which might make it possible for us to make progress. I mean, as you've mentioned some of them, there is now a greater sense amongst some of the population, at least, that the right to health is a fundamental human right. And I think that's important. I think it's also important that there are now more judges that are struggling with the issue of the right to health. And there are more people taking cases to courts. And so the right to health, I think, is going up the agenda. There's more scholarship as well, which is important. My sense is that we're sort of reaching a point where it's going to be difficult to ignore this human rights stuff in the context of health systems. You see, one reason why governments in the past have been able to, in a way very justifiably, brush it aside is because it wasn't clear what it meant. And it was very fair for a minister to turn to me when I was Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health and say, well, this is all very well, but what does it actually mean? And until quite recently, we haven't known what it means. But now we are getting a sense of what the right to health means in practice, operationally, being very practical. And I think that will help us really make practical operational advances that eluded us in the last 15, 20 years. I think we're going to have to make progress sort of along these different fronts at roughly the same time. I personally, what I think is terribly important is that health professionals begin to appreciate that this human rights language can assist them better fulfill their professional responsibilities. It's not just something that's going to be rather awkward and embarrassing. It can actually, it's a tool that can help them do their job better. I think that's critically important. And I think it's critically important that the human rights experts sit with those health professionals and together work out how to operationalize it. And I think that for me is the critical challenge. And I think we've got no more excuses now. You know, we've had people arguing that there's a philosophical objection to the right to health. Well, for the most part, we've sort of won that argument. And we had another fight for 15 years whether or not the right to health was justiciable, whether you could go to court about it. That absorbed a lot of our energy. That discussion is largely settled now. So now I think we've got every reason to turn to this central issue of how to practically operationalize the right to health and other human rights. What difference would it make to doctors in their practices, to water engineers who are trying to put in a sanitation system, to directors of hospitals? And that to me is an exciting challenge, and I think we're now better positioned to make progress in that respect than ever before. It raises a really challenging question of prioritization. And speaking very frankly, I think that the human rights community, with some notable exceptions, the human rights community has not been very good at turning its mind to this problem of prioritization. And I think we can no longer evade it. We've got to grasp this nettle and come up with an answer to the question that I used to be asked by ministers of health quite often. The question was, Mr. Special Rapporteur, you've asked me to do about 5 or 6 things. I have a finite budget. I cannot do all of them. Which should I prioritize? And I would be asked that question, and it's a difficult question to answer. And I think that now the human rights community needs to formulate a proper way of responding to that question. It requires to get clear some philosophical issues, actually. It requires to get clear a process, a fair, transparent process of prioritizing, and it requires getting a set of criteria crystal clear, and then it requires judicial oversight to make sure that serious errors are not made. So that's the challenge that lies ahead, and I think it's a priority actually for the human rights community to have a credible view on prioritization, in the next 1 or 2 years.